what I use is lesson 3. The effects of material progress on the production and distribution of wealth. I think this is really the point at which somebody gets how the distribution of wealth manifests itself and how Henry George was so right. Let's see if you agree with me when we get through this section. Now, George says the primary distribution of wealth is dual, not tripartite. Capital is but a form of labor, like skilled and unskilled. Rent, the greater result that comes from superior land, the natural opportunity. And rent measures that which results from an advantage, which is exactly what Ron said earlier. And Ricardo says, the rent of land is determined by the excess of its produce over that which the same application of labor and capital can secure from the least productive land in use. Again, just as Ron said it was. And of course, Henry George just changes that last point and says the most productive land that is still free. Which, of course, is exactly the same thing, isn't it? As long as there is free land out there, because nobody is going to use less productive land as long as more productive land is still free. So it's the same thing, as long as there's free land. But when there ceases to be any free land, then of course you have to say, state it the way Ricardo did.
The least productive land in use.
Use, yeah. Now, what is the potential rent of land as opposed to the actual rent of land? What could have been produced by virtue of the superior land yields the potential rent? And some people would say the sum total of all the advantages minus the disadvantages of a location. There we are, location. So there it is. What could have been produced by virtue of superior land? But that's not exactly right, is it? There's more to it. Because, as you say, it's the excess above and beyond what can be produced on the least productive land in use. Now there's our hypothetical territory that I used a couple of weeks ago. And I gave some numbers and said, well, if we added up everything that was produced and divided by the number of days that it took to produce it, we'd say on average $9 a day, $8 a day because of the swamp and access to the river and to trade. Even though the land is just as fertile, it's not going to yield as much because of the inhibiting trade. And here it's less fertile, so 7, and less fertile again, 6. But there's still land that will yield $6 a day. So no one would work for someone else unless they were paid at least $6 a day. Here's our community, and this might be the very best farmland, but pretty soon we build a bridge across the river and over the swamp, and a nice road connecting all these farmers to the best farmland, which now becomes the center of a little community. And somebody sets up a blacksmith shop and a general store and a post office and a veterinary clinic. Now we've got a much more efficient community, don't we? And if we were to double production again, to reflect it, here the most valuable land is the little village, shall we say, with commercial activity, and then the best farmland and so on. What actually creates the value of land?
All the structure and infrastructure.
And you said it, and you said it, and you said it. All, didn't you? It's the presence of people that creates the value of land, right? They come together and they cooperate and they increase productivity. But where the land is free, the population is always sparse. And they don't have that potential to cooperate, equal potential to cooperate and so on. So that greater productivity, which comes from the presence of denser population, attaches to the land. And the infrastructure enables a denser population. Right? And the denser the population, the greater subdivisions of labor, the greater the economies of scale. And I suppose, and even taller buildings. I mean, what if every building in Manhattan was 2 stories tall, would the value of land in Manhattan be as great as it is today?
No.
No, because, and not because of the buildings, but because
Not
the people who the buildings enabled to come here. Now, I often thought, after 9/11, if there had been, everybody said, hey, I'm getting the hell out of New York, I'm not going back there, we're leaving, and half the population of New York had left. What did Ron had a fancy term for it, all other things being equal. What was it?
Ceteris paribus. Yes.
Say it again?
Ceteris paribus.
Oh, I like it. All other things being equal, what would happen to the value of land?
That's my boy.
It would go down, wouldn't it? Because you wouldn't have the divisions of labor. There would be all these other things too. You'd have all this investment in the subway, but only half as many people would be riding the subway. So the economy would be lost there too, and so on it goes. All right. So here we are. And the question I have is, if Marcial, Ibrahim, who got the first parcels of land, remember? If you guys had it to do over again, well, let me just review this for a second. You worked like hell when you got that first piece of land. Nobody was there. You were by yourselves. You got $9 a day. Now, if you do the same amount of work and the same amount of labor and capital, same amount of tools and equipment and capital, you get all 36. But if you get somebody else to supply the labor and the capital, you give them 16 and you get 20. So if you had it to do over again, would you have taken that 100 or 200 acres each?
Take it all.
Every
As
bit
much
you could
as
get
they-
your hands on, right? And what did happen in the United States of America? What became the United States of America? So I've said, well, what would happen if we just held 1 out of every 4 parcels of land for speculation? You know, people holding it as an appreciating asset because they know as population increases, as invention goes on, as the infrastructure is built, the land's going to increase in value. Let's just hold on to it. What did Will Rogers say? They ain't making any more of it. So there it is, 1 out of every 4 parcels. And of course, it's not just farmland, and in fact, farmland is one of those things where you can use it and you can hold it for the increase in value too. But industrial, commercial, residential land, and so on. And of course, the classic is this little space. The classic is 28th and Park Avenue. About 1/4 of an acre, it looked like to me. And for at least 50 years, it sat there. You can see the ads on the adjacent buildings for typewriters and adding machines. You know, it's been 50 years since there was a building there. And I'm told it's just sold for $134 million.
It's about 13,000 square foot.
Yeah, whatever. Boy, you got a good
I
mind
was
there.
thinking about it a little earlier.
So you say, well, this is, we know that, and I'm not sure if they're done building, but you know that that's at least the highest and best use is at least what they've done there or pretty close to it. So you say to yourself, how many jobs and housing units was the community deprived of by this one surface parking lot? So it's not just non-use of land, but this gross underuse of land that prematurely extends the frontier. Here we have some buildings next door to that, what was the parking lot, and I don't know, are they still there? Or were they taken up by that
I think there's
big
another
building?
big highway. So.
That they were there, but there were 2 or 3 story buildings, and obviously, 40 or 50 stories probably was the highest and best use. So you can see how many jobs and how many or housing units could have been built there. And when you take the big picture, you can see how this gobbles up acres and acres of land. So I've just held 1/4 of each block of land out of use for people who are just hoarding it because they know it's increasing in value. And so there I've got pushed the margin 2 blocks. See, it was at 16, now it's down to 8. So if the most that I can produce with my labor and capital is $8 a day, my wages are going to be $8 a day. So this premature extension of the frontier offsets inventions, innovations, the infrastructure, cooperation, and it drives wages down. And of course, 36 minus 8 is 28. 32 minus 8 is 24. And so it drives wages down and it drives the rent up. By about 1890, there ain't no more free land. It's gone. Okay, sorry. Now, I have no way to employ myself. So I come to Alan. Alan, I need a job. Can you hire me? What's he going to ask me? Well, do you have any skills? No, but I work as hard as I can. I'm, normal, average guy. I work as hard as I can. How much will you pay me, Alan?
The last 1898.
He says, how much were you willing
$10
to,
an hour maybe?
how much am I willing to work for? Is probably what you're going to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just enough to live.
You know, they meet your question with a question, right? I say, how much can you pay me? He says, I do want to hire you. How much are you willing to work for? I'm getting hungry, Alan. Make me a deal. And, well, what's the least I'm going to accept?
Subsistence.
Right? And if he doesn't pay me food, clothing, and shelter, is he going to get as much work out of me? No. I'm going to be hungry, I'm going to be weak, and he's going to get less profit or income from me, right? So basically, we could say as a generalization that wages of the least productive workers, the least skilled and educated, tend to a bare subsistence. In the free market. When there was free land, I could go to the free land, put my sheep out there, and whatever the value of that sheep increased after I paid the labor, that's my interest, right? But remember, there ain't no free land. There's no place I can put my capital to use. I got no options. So, I come to the Alan again. It's either I rent the land from Alan so I can put my sheep to graze, or I say, okay, I'll lend you the sheep. And we're back in the same debate, aren't we? How much are you going to pay me for the sheep? And Alan says, well, Mike, what's your alternative? If you don't lend them to me, what are you going to do with them? And I guess all the landowners say the same thing, and they may compete a little bit for it. But the tendency is for interest to return to capital when there's no free land to fall to a point. If it fell anymore, there'd be a shortage of capital. It wouldn't be there for the landowners to borrow, and what would happen if there was a shortage of capital? What would happen in production? It would go down. So I like to say, wages and interest fall to an amount below which productivity would fall. So it can't go below that, or productivity falls, and if productivity falls, obviously if these numbers fall, the rent of land is going to fall. But then I just made up this number 3. If that number were 3, that would mean 36 minus 3, 33, 32 minus 3, 29, and so on. And I think that clearly represents the reality. Now, one thing I wanted to say, I had it in that little margin there, a note. One of the brilliant analogies that George makes, you probably remember it, is about the island, Robinson Crusoe. He says, if you put 100 people on an island from which there is no escape, and he says you make one of those people the owner of the other 99 people, or you make that one person the owner of the island, makes no difference to him or to the other 99 people, though. And because their only alternative is to swim out in the sea and drown. And I don't know what could be a better analogy. So there we have it. The more land that's held for speculation, the more unemployment there's going to be. And every time the population increases, every time inventions replace workers, more land is needed. Now, that's basically where I would stop with that segment. For many years now, I have heard people say, okay, but there ain't no free land right now, and so things are kind of turned upside down on their head, and if we could just lend money to the landowners of the country because the non-landowners really can't do anything. They have no means of production. But we could lend the landowners money, they could buy capital, and that would make the workers efficient and put them to work.
Yep.
So I said, well, okay, let's think about this job creation. Let's think about this for a minute. Now, hopefully, the next time, if there ever is one, I'll be able to do this in less, with less slides and so on. But there's my model when there is free land. And so, there's always full employment when there's free land, except in Senegal.
And not only
But you
Senegal.
can see as a concept,
I can tell you that.
if there's free land out there, and this free land will support more than a bare subsistence, then how can there be unemployment? I mean, people don't want to starve to death, they'll go and grow some food and eat it. And wages and interest are higher both as a portion of what you produce and as an amount as well. Therefore, there is a far greater incentive to accumulate capital and, in its most efficient form and use it efficiently and receive higher wages and higher interest. I can't think of anything that could create a greater incentive to produce than high wages and high interest, a reward to both labor and capital. And of course, by capital, I'm saying the return to buildings, machines, inventories that facilitate the exchange of goods. Now then we get to the point where there is no free land, which is the reality we face today. Some segment of the population is always unemployed. Wages and interest fall to that minimum below which productivity would fall. And of course we intervene with all these different things like the minimum wage and OSHA and Social Security and so on. And of course, what we're saying here is that if interest were any lower, there'd be a shortage of capital available for loan, and productivity would fall. So at this point, what do the politicians say? What have they been saying, especially around the end of 2008? Bail the banks out. Yeah, and then they can lend money. And we can get the economy going, and we can get people back to work, because everything, every argument to spend money and to create money was jobs, 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 right? And so if we can lower interest rates, employers can borrow money, buy capital, hire people to work, and of course government guaranteed loans. I guess that's what General Motors and Chrysler got. And all instant depreciation.
You
You
don't
buy,
have socialism in the United States.
yeah, you buy a building and it's depreciated
Those
instantly.
countries.
I guess that probably would imply
Not for
machine and so on. So the basic equation, of course, is production minus wages minus interest equals land rent. And so anytime idle land goes into production, I have to agree, it creates jobs. And if we weren't in a recession, expanding the money supply would cause what? Inflation. And what is inflation but the robbery of all those who save or are owed money? Is that a fair statement? But I still have to agree that a bigger income is an incentive to hire people. That is to say, when the landowners get a bigger incentive, a bigger income, that's an incentive to hire people. And I also think you're going to agree that as interest rates go down, well, let me just ask you, do more people buy corporate bonds, or less people? When the interest rate goes down, the sale of corporate bonds goes down, doesn't it? So there's less capital in the form of buildings, machines, and so on, borrowed by the corporation from the private sector. Now, as wages or interest go down, what happens to the rent of land? It goes up, doesn't it? Right. So I mean, it's a seesaw equation. So even though there's the countervailing force that the private sector stops lending money when interest rates go down, as long as the Fed can create it and lend it to corporations at a cheaper rate, they have it. I have to concede there is an incentive to accumulate capital, to hire people, have them produce a product, and the landowners get the income. And without labor and capital, the land sits idle and there ain't no income.
But
Right?
that's not what happened.
Pardon me?
But that's not what happened.
Well, that's all right, there you go. So I was going to, I said, well, let's go back to 2008. Interest rates were 7% in 2008. So I said, yeah, well, and they fell to 3.25% and everything. I said, well, they lowered interest rates, yeah. But then, of course, you have to look at inflation, don't you? So let's say I borrow $1 million just to make it plausible. At the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, 7% interest. I hire people to build me a building, and I buy all this equipment to make socks, so there's no big risk involved. I mean, people have got to wear socks. And so for every $100 I borrow, I got to pay back $7 in interest. But at the end of 2008, I looked it up, inflation was 3.8%. So if, what does that mean? That money lost 3.8% of its value. So what happened to the value of my building and my machinery? If money lost 3.8% of its value, what happened to the value?
Number went up.
The value, yeah, the numbers went up, not the real value, but the measurable value. So what real rate of interest did I pay? Given that the value of my capital that I bought with the money has increased by 3.8%.
7 minus 3.8.
Yeah, I'm only paying 3.2% interest. So that's, it sounds like 7%, but it was really 3.2% when you figure it out. So then I go to $3.20 on 100 or 3.2%. So then I go to the next year, 2009, and all the time I'm trying to be objective here, and I'm thinking, well, interest rates really went down, but apparently they didn't that first year. In fact, the next year they lowered interest rates in 2009 to 3.25%. That's what the best, prime rate, what the corporations can borrow for if they got good credit, good collateral. And there was no inflation. In fact, there was 0.04% deflation. The money actually increased in value by just a little bit, but enough to be able to say we had deflation. So 4 cents on $100, it's not much, but that pushed it up to $3.29 a hundred. So interest actually went up a little bit. But then they kept interest rates at 3.25%, and they didn't bother doing all the math, looking at every year. But in 2013, the end of the chart last year, interest was 3.25%, and inflation was 1.5%. So real rate of interest did fall from 3.2 or 3.29 the next year to 1.75. So, okay, so interest went down, and I guess interest rates, we'd have to acknowledge that they did fall, and so the corporations had the incentive to hire people. But at the same time, we have just the opposite incentive working. If the interest rate goes down, it increases the income from land, right? And so, what does the higher income do to the price of land? It makes it go up. You with me on this? So, what about if the value of the land is going up? What does that do to the incentive to sell it so somebody can go to work on it? It diminishes it, doesn't it?
Yes, you want to keep.
So I say, first of all, I started out thinking interest rates really had fallen dramatically from 7 to 3.25. But when I factored in inflation, I realized no, they haven't. No, they haven't fallen. And they did fall a little, I can see, with this one down to 1.7%. So there was that force that landowners could could borrow capital cheaper. But at the same time, the selling price of land probably didn't fall as much because of the lower interest rate. It was a countervailing force. And you may remember from that first session, from 2010 until the end of 2013, 0.3% more of the population was working than was at the depths of the recession. So it clearly, it didn't really work. Now, the population increased, there were hundreds of thousands of jobs created, but the population increased by 9 million people from 2010 to 2013. And it looks like about half of those people, more than half of them, were immigrants who came for these high-paid jobs. I thought it must have been all of them because I know our birth rate is just enough to keep the population. But I guess because we're living longer, the age rate, I think for every death, there's 2 births or something. So the population is increasing. But you can see, so interest rates weren't much lower and they didn't really create enough jobs.
Not good jobs either.
And not good, well, no, not good jobs. But I think most of those good jobs that we think about were probably union jobs, right? And the unions are busted. All right, so one of the things that George made a big deal of, and in my lifetime, and especially since I got interested in Henry George, I've seen, go all the way around on, is the world overpopulated or isn't it overpopulated? I mean, when I first got interested in Henry George, there was a big organization called Zero Population Growth or something. Oh boy, we got to stop, people, we got to promote birth control, and then, don't worry about that. And then more recently, it's not the population, but pollution. And yet we also hear, hey, there's no reason you can't produce things in it without causing carbon dioxide or pollution. You can do it. Solar energy is clearly available now if you just are willing to do it. So the world population is now over 7 billion. UN estimates of the world estimates that the world could feed 33 billion people. That's a lot. 7 times what is 33? Assuming we use modern farming methods. They estimate that the world population will be 10 billion by the middle of the 21st century. So even if it was 10 billion in the world and the United States increased in population at the same rate as the world evenly, we would still have less people per square mile of arable land than the country of France. And France has a relatively high standard of living. Fair enough? 842 million people are hungry, many more are in poverty, and so the question is it because of overpopulation? If too many people cause hunger, most hunger would be in densely populated countries. Fair enough? So, we look at Africa, which has 14% of the world's population and 12% of its arable land. That's pretty close. In fact, the last time I looked at this, it was, I think it was 11% of the world's population. Now it's 14. But anyway, and yet Africa has the most hungry people and the most impoverished people. And then I thank Ibrahim who updated this chart for me. We look at the most densely populated country in the world. This is just the arable land because deserts and stuff mountains don't count. South Korea, 7,700 people per square mile. Japan, 7,500. And yet, look at how productive they are. 33,000 per year, 37,000 per year. And then we get to Egypt. Almost 7,000 people per square mile and $700 a year. South Korea has no people in extreme poverty, that is living on less than $2 a day, none in Japan. Egypt, 25% of the population live in extreme poverty. Bangladesh, 76%. And it's increasing. The last time I did this figure, it was 49%. Philippines, I didn't realize they were so bad off, 41.5% impoverished. They're one of them, and I didn't realize they were quite so densely populated. That's the 3rd largest English-speaking country in the world with something like 150 million people, maybe 200 million, I forget now. A lot of people. We get down here to England and the United Kingdom, 2,700 people per square mile, $37,500. China, 9,000, but 27% of their people are in serious poverty. India, 68%, 69% of their people are living in extreme poverty. Less densely populated than China, and way less densely populated than the United Kingdom, than England and Scotland. And then, of course, Mexico, 52%. That's unbelievable, isn't it? And that's way up from the last time I did this chart.
It's equivalent,
France, of course, no one serious. And look, the United States, nothing, but there's only 464 people per square mile of arable land. Russia, 11% are impoverished, and there's only 303 people per square mile of arable land. There is no correlation between the density of population and the level and extent of poverty. It's just not there. You can't say the world's overpopulated. It might be, but you can't, there's no evidence to support it. And so George says, well, in impoverished countries, have the natural resources been largely exhausted? I mean, Nigeria might be a classic, where they got all this oil and all this poverty, right? In impoverished countries, does all the wealth go to the people who produce it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't in the United States either, but it certainly doesn't. So maybe we ought to be looking at the distribution of wealth rather than the correlation between the density of population. Where do we find the greatest evidences of wealth? In densely or sparsely populated communities? Well, I guess we could say, let's take Manhattan, because, boy, that's a densely populated community, and we see wealth beyond belief, don't we? And then we go to Nevada, and even lately with the oil and so on, there probably isn't much wealth there at all, because they don't have the potential to subdivide their labor, to cooperate in economies of scale.